Hello. Should probably turn off this light or close this shade. 1 second.
Okay. Masha, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Excellent. Just to warn you, I will briefly introduce everyone in German. So don't worry, and then I'll switch into English.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
A very warm welcome. I'm happy to welcome you. This is an extraordinary edition of the Streitraum. We will talk about Quo Vadis, Amerika, extraordinary, because we are hybrid, as they say. That is to say, I'm sitting in Hall C of Schaubühne, unfortunately without the audience, and I've one guest in New York and one guest here on stage. But I'm very happy that we have the opportunity to do this. And for Masha Gessen, our guest, we have changed the hour, so to speak. We are normally meeting in the afternoon or at noon. But now we meet at 6 p.m. We will ask ourselves what the last 4 years of Trump's presidency have meant and will mean. Has democracy changed? The discourse changed? Has there been a damage caused to politics on an international level? What about the long-term impact? What about the long-term impact of Black Lives Matter? That's another question, including their criticism with respect to the, for a long time, not treated Black heritage of the United States. And now I will speak English, and I would like to thank the 2 interpreters who will be with us tonight, and they will translate into English and into German. Lilian Astrid Gese and Guda Turo. Thank you very much.
My first guest is Masha Gessen, born 1967 in Moscow, an award-winning writer, a regular commentator for The New Yorker, author of numerous books, many of them also translated into German. I have the last one here with me. This is the last one in German, Autokratie überwinden. Gessen received the National Book Award in 2017 and the Preis für Europäische Verständigung in 2019. What isn't mentioned in the official text is Gessen is also a radical cyclist, if I may say so, and almost a regular here at the Schaubühne. Welcome, Masha Gessen in New York.
Thank you. It's great to be here virtually.
And my other guest is Mercy Secret. He's born in 1979 in Atlanta. He's an independent journalist based in Brooklyn. He worked as a reporter for the New York Times, the non-profit investigative newsroom ProPublica, and several alternative weekly newspapers. He's the recipient of many awards, among them the North Carolina Press Association Award for Investigative Reporting and a 2019 Silvers Grant for Work in Progress from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. Secret is currently a guest here in Berlin at the American Academy. Welcome, Mercy Secret.
Thank you.
I can say to everyone in the audience who's listening, and I say that in German in a second again, you're most welcome to use the commentary function and ask questions throughout the conversation. At the end of our conversation, I can pose these questions to my two guests. Herzliche Einladung an alle, die online zuschauen. Sie können sehr, sehr gerne über die Kommentarfunktion Fragen stellen. Die Fragen werden gegen Ende unseres Gesprächs dann hineingereicht und ich kann sie an die beiden Gäste stellen. I would like to structure our conversation a little and begin by talking just about the most recent developments in the last week or last 10 days, and then take a broader perspective and focus and look on the 4 years of the presidency of Trump. Let me begin with you, Mosi. Last Saturday, when CNN projected Joe Biden to win the presidency, I felt not just relief, as I would have anticipated, but also sorrow and grief. And I was actually really surprised about the pain that I felt over the past 4 years. How is that for you on the day when, last Saturday, when they projected Joe Biden to win?
I think I can relate to that feeling. I mean, I was watching the returns and just really the number of people who voted for Donald Trump was very surprising to me. I mean, as I'm sure you know, and many of your viewers or listeners know, more people voted for him than had voted for anyone else in the history of the presidency. And it only so happened that Biden happened to have more votes. But it was an incredible amount of people who voted for someone who I thought, you know, kind of embodied so many things that were wrong. You know, the response to the pandemic most recently, but also the treatment and his handling of immigrants at the border and scandal after scandal and all of these things. And so there was this sense that even though there was relief that that Biden won, there was also this feeling like that so many, almost half of the country still voted for Trump. And what does this mean? These people are not going to disappear. The emotion and the whatever it was that drew those people to Trump remains. And so I wonder where that goes now.
Masha, the final results will now confirm Joe Biden wins 306 electoral college votes versus 232 for Donald Trump. But we have an unprecedented situation with the president now almost admitting that Biden won, but claims fraud. I think his most recent tweet of today says he only won in the eyes of the fake news media. I concede nothing. Before we discuss this post-presidency, or whatever we call it, I would like to know, did you expect this situation, or were you surprised?
Well, of course I expected the situation, but so did everybody else who was listening to Trump, because Trump told us exactly what he was going to do, right? I mean, it's, you know, it doesn't take huge insight into Trump's psyche. It takes a suspension of disbelief, right? We have to believe what this man says. And that's kind of been my argument for 4 years. But he was telling us that he doesn't trust the electoral system, that he considers it fundamentally suspect, that even when he won, he couldn't help himself. And he kept talking about electoral fraud and about millions of people voting illegally. So we knew he was going to do this. And he also, you know, people were ridiculously, to my mind, asking him, are you going to concede if you lose? And he kept saying, I'm not going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. So he was quite open about it. But I just want to note, you mentioned his tweets, which he's been tweeting rather heavily over the last 24 hours about so-called election fraud. And so Twitter, to their credit, has been highlighting or flagging his tweets with the phrase, "This claim about election fraud is
It's
disputed."
disputed, yes.
And this, to me, is one of the starkest illustrations of the futility of trying to battle Donald Trump's war on facts and shared reality. Because to say that this claim about election fraud is disputed is to say, for one thing, that election fraud is a thing that exists. Right? It should really say this claim about election fraud, and not is disputed, but is untrue. I mean, we have elections for a reason. We have mechanisms of counting, and it is actually possible to say this is untrue, right? And so he gained so much ground against reality just by creating this chaos.
Well, I think there's two aspects that are interesting about this. The one is the one that you mentioned, is that after 4 years, his subversion of the concept of truth has been so successful that the comment is just disputed, as if Daniel Mendelsohn today said, as if you would say Elvis is still alive, is a disputed speech act. But the other one that I find interesting is, since when does Twitter do this? Flag at all his tweets? Because I would say, I don't know exactly when they started doing it, but I would say the first 3.5 years, they didn't. So you also wonder what brought about that change.
Well, what brought about the change was the expectation of this election chaos. Twitter, I believe, started doing this over the summer, and it had to do with the election, because Donald Trump started preparing the ground for not recognizing election results earlier, but in the summer it sort of kicked into high gear. But you're right, we've raised the bar for lying. The networks and the New York Times have started calling Trump's lies very explicitly, very forcefully after he was voted out of office. Right? Before that, the bar for saying lie was incredibly high. Like, he had to lie outrageously, hugely, forcefully, and still National Public Radio, the public broadcaster, would not use the word lie. They would only use things like disputed claim or false claim.
But what's the reason for this? Is that because there's a sort of confusion about the idea of neutrality within American journalism? Is that the source of this? I would call it cowardice, to call a lie a lie. Is that what's underlying it?
I think so. I think that there are notions in American journalism that in order to be objective, for a piece to be objective, it has to equivocate. It has to say, on the one hand, on the other hand, and leave what remains for the reader to figure out. And there is a real hesitance for reporters, editors, to kind of come down on these kinds of things. And as Masha said, it started, with the first election and really got us into a lot of trouble. But there is this, and I think that that's something that Trump has been able to. That's one of the reasons he's been able to manipulate that. He knows about these standards, and he knows that that journalists won't really kind of come down on these things. And so he's able to say these things that really kind of sow this kind of chaos and leave readers, viewers, whatever, with confusion. And one would hope that these outlets would have the moral courage, as you said, to kind of come down really hard on this, but it's like totally outside of their DNA to take that stand.
You said it causes chaos or confusion. Now, if we look at the images of yesterday, the demonstrations in Washington, I would say it's not just confusion, but it's anger, it's rage. It's really an anger that has a reference point in a different reality, so to speak. We saw, I mean, conspiracy ideologue like Alex Jones was there yesterday. Enrique Tarrio, the chairman of the far-right group Proud Boys, was there. And from you know, the images that we saw people carrying flags, not just with Trump 2020, keep America great. Now that didn't, you know, surprise me really, but also Trump 2020, no more bullshit. And Trump pro-life, pro-God, pro-gun. Now, when you look at these images, is that the last dance of, you know, a segment that is at the fringes, or is this the prospect of what is to come?
It's really hard to say. What did you see any numbers on the amount of people who were actually?
Well, depending on who you asked and who the sources were, I read a few thousand. They themselves claimed it was 1 million, but I don't know. From what I read, a few thousand.
Yeah, that's what I mean. When the people who you see, yes, they are outrageous and they're scary, but I can't tell how and what numbers they are and how big they are, and how scared we should be. If it's only a couple of thousand people who have come from all over the United States, maybe that will peter out. That's what I wonder. I know that these movements proliferate online, and there's this segment that you can't really count because it's all happening in chat rooms, and the ones who are coming out in person are perhaps the ones who are the most vocal. But still, I wonder. I just wonder about the numbers.
Mm-hmm. If I would reflect on the same question here in Europe or in Germany, I would say, yes, there is an asymmetrical representation of right radical movements who get an enormous amount of attention in the media, and yet I would say qualitatively, even if the numbers are smaller than one might suspect, you know, from the representation on the media, I would say they're viciously violent, highly dangerous, extremely well organized, not just nationally anymore, but internationally. Here, I would say what distinguishes them from previous right-wing movements is that you used to be able to differentiate between sort of the right-wing intellectuals, you know, the writers, the publish houses. You know, that was one group, highly intellectual, highly, you know, extremely sophisticated right-wing people. Then you had a right extreme or right radical or right populist party entering local parliaments, usually not terribly successful in the long run and usually dropping out at some point. And then you had the hardcore, hard radical, you know, violent groups on the streets. And I think, you know, you could find each of these segments scary, but they weren't necessarily connected. What has changed here is that these different groups now relate to each other. They are connected. They nurture each other. And of course, with the political representation, they have a way to normalize, you know, their ideology. So Masha, would you say something similar can be seen in the US?
Yes. So I want to say a couple of things. One, actually circling back to your first question, and the word normalized that you just used. I think one of the shocking things about the election, even though, like you, I felt a kind of brief moment of relief when CNN called the election on Saturday morning New York time. But if you look at the results of this election, it looks like any other American election, except for the turnout, right? But in terms of percentages, it looks like a normal election. A normal American election, actually, in terms of probabilities, looks like a coin toss, right? This is something I think that we don't talk about enough, because in Europe, of course, people are used to much bigger margins, partly because of the multi-party systems. Right? In the United States, mostly we're talking about 49, 51% in any given year, right? And this year looks like any other year in that sense. And that, I think, is terrifying. It looks like a normal election when it shouldn't be normal. And it's directly related to what you're asking about, which is that, I would say that how significant the protest and the refusal to accept the results of the election that we're watching now, how significant it is for the next few years depends really on Washington. And it depends on two things in Washington. One is the Republican Party, which has not just allowed itself to become basically an autocratic party, but has thrown itself into Trump's arms over the last 3.5, 4 years. From going from the 2015, 2016 primaries, when you had Republicans looking at Trump as an interloper and a disruptor, to basically turning into an autocratic party, right? And by that, I mean something very specific. If you listen to US Republicans, to elected officials, they sound like they have an audience of one. And that audience is Donald Trump. Right? They're always talking to him.
Out of conviction or out of fear, or what's the motivation? Is that because they suspect him to be still so powerful, or because 70 million people voted for? What's the motivation?
I think it's pragmatic. I think it's that he can commit political assassination by tweet at any time. Tweeting about any one of these elected Republicans can cost them their job, or tweeting by Donald Trump. And so they talk to him. But I think that has structurally transformed the party. It has, there's no possibility of any kind of solidarity within the party against Donald Trump. They're directed at this one patron who distributes power, who distributes influence, who distributes, in a sense, even money, because he is in charge of whether they keep their jobs or not. Mm-hmm. Right? So the question is, will they reconstitute themselves again over the next 4 years or before the next presidential election? Or will they basically remain an autocratic party? And then the question is what Joe Biden does. I have a great fear that he's going to act as though this were a normal election. That he's a lovely man who values and even fetishizes sort of bipartisanship and working the system and this whole sort of his ability to get things done the Washington way. And in some ways, that's exactly the wrong thing for now. Right? Because what we need is somebody in the White House who will ask, what is it in the structures of American institutions that allowed us to get here in the first place? And if that doesn't happen, we're at huge risk of seeing a more efficient and effective repeat.
I still have one question regarding these last days, and then more on the previous 4 years. What we saw in the last couple of days was we saw the sacking of the Secretary of Defense, Trump presiding over a number of other firings in the security apparatus, and Dexter Filkins, I think, in the New Yorker asked the question whether this was a serious attempt of a coup, or whether this was just, well, now what do we call this? You know, a spectacle, you know, con. I have to admit that of all the worrying moments, these, you know, this subversion of the security institution, I have to admit, worries me the most. Now, so I'm curious, you know, what's your take on this? Do you think this will just be another con, or is that a serious attempt for a coup?
Yeah, I would be very curious to hear what Masha thinks about this as well. Maybe I'm naive in this area, but I don't see how, practically speaking, that there could be a coup in the United States at this moment. I just don't see how it would happen. I don't see, it's just hard for me to imagine how it would happen. So on a kind of surface way, it is concerning that the Secretary of Defense was fired and the kind of rumors of these other dismissals, but still I don't see how we could kind of get to the point where he would stay in office.
Masha?
So first of all, I think it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, okay.
Every
Fair enough.
coup begins as a con. Right? The question is does it reach the point where enough people in power believe that the person or people staging the coup are in charge? Right? Ultimately, a coup is a series of decision points made by people in uniform about who they're taking orders from. Now, Donald Trump remains commander-in-chief until January 20th. Is he going to issue orders that allow him to stay in power or to stay in the White House? And if he does, is he going to issue orders that are so clearly illegitimate and so clearly illegal that the military command will not obey them?
What could those orders be?
Well, I'm surprised, for example, that now it's already, that it's even possible to exclude the Biden team from security briefings. I mean, I would have thought that this would be structurally impossible.
Right, and it's not, you know. What would those orders be that would allow him to stay in the White House? Actually, I don't think that's possible in the end. I think we still have a couple of inflection points in December when states certify their electors and when the electors meet. That actually hasn't happened. Not a terrible thing to keep in mind, right? At this point, we seem to be on track. I was really worried, when we were at the New Yorker, we were gaming at what might happen in the week after the election. One thing that I realized that he could do earlier on was shut down the post office. That's actually possible, right? He didn't do it. But there are disruptive things that he could do that are within his power. At this point, I don't think he has a route to actually staying in the White House. But to the question, you know, of this, is this a coup or is this a con? Yes, of course it's an attempted coup, right? An attempted coup is always a con. Does he have an avenue to actually maintaining power? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. If we think and reflect now a little bit about these past 4 years and what they really meant for American democracy, I would start by saying Trump constituted, first and foremost, a threat to the idea of equality, a threat to the understanding of legality, to the normative idea of contracts and agreements that are binding. I think he also constituted a threat to language as a means to communicate with certain rules. I think he constituted a threat to scientific knowledge as a reference point for modern society. But I would like to begin with the question of equality and how he's had, or if he has had, a lasting effect with his support for white supremacists. He has had not just support, but he elevated the discourse and the narrative of the alt-right movement. He had frequent references to QAnon. He relativized the violence of far-right terrorists, or police violence against blacks. Could you mostly give me an assessment of how long-lasting do you think this racist ideology and practice will be?
I think about the first election, or his first victory, and his victory, and the sense among many people that there was some type of fluke, that he had conned people into supporting him, and that he was kind of this outside force who stepped in and somehow assumed power. But when we look at the results of the most recent election, it becomes clearer to me that
it wasn't a misunderstanding.
It was not, and that he was in fact the manifestation of something that was already there. And so when looking at the impact that he has had over the last 4 years, I see it as kind of elevating or kind of allowing out to the open a sentiment that was lurking beneath the surface, and that has lurked beneath the surface throughout American history and has bubbled up at various periods. When looking at, I think your question was, is the long,
long lasting.
How long lasting this is. I think these are issues that Americans have been dealing with on the issue of equality throughout the country's history, and there has not been a real kind of national reckoning with the treatment, in particular, of racial minorities in the United States. I think that there is that Americans kind of believe in this myth of racial progress, or kind of progress in general. This idea that things are getting better and better, and things have always gotten better and better, and that maybe even we reached the pinnacle with the election of a black president. But it's actually the case that that these things keep popping up and they keep returning, and that there's a vast kind of underclass of African Americans who have less access to health care and education, and who are kind of locked in the criminal justice system. That has not changed, and the sentiment on the right, on the right, and among many white Americans has not changed. So I'm not really hopeful for like an immediate turnaround. I don't see how that would happen.
So if I understand you correctly, you would say it wasn't, as many people, I think, in the beginning of the first election suggested, it's either just a response to the Obama years, or it's just it's a protest vote, so to speak. And you would rather say it's a symptom of something that is much deeper embedded in American history?
Yes, that's what I would say, especially after this most recent election. I mean, I think it was tempting to say after the first election that there was some type of, economic, kind of coming out of the Tea Party movement, and there was an economic kind of grievance that people had, that they were being left behind, and they saw in Trump someone who would deliver them from this kind of diminishment in status. But I don't think that's what it was, kind of looking at this most recent election. I think that there was, as you said, something that was lurking, and Trump is a symptom of that.
But would you then say, if this really has, roots and there's a continuum also to this racial injustice. Would you say the Black Lives Matter movement was able to disrupt it and really intervene, or do you think that was just a momentary, I don't know, hopeful interruption?
When those protests happened, I was in New York after George Floyd died, and I remember conversations with friends in which we really felt like something had changed. Like there was an incredible amount of hope. People left their homes, went out into the pandemic air to protest this murder, and it was mostly white people in most cities, and then globally. And so there was this sense that very, very quickly the conversation changed. Very quickly, various kinds of laws were changed in different places. Chokeholds were banned in different places. Minneapolis talked about disbanding their police department. And there was real hope. But it petered out. It seems like it petered out. I mean, I think a week or two ago, there was a Pew study that found that interest in the Black Lives Matter movement has decreased since June among all groups, all racial groups except African Americans. And so, but basically what it says to me is that everyone else kind of returned to life as normal, even though normal is very weird now. But people have the moment has passed. The things, those laws that were changed, I don't see there being the will to do that right now. It was a May, June kind of thing, and now it seems to be gone. And I think that has been consistent in the Black Lives Matter movement, that there have been these swells of energy around the very, very tragic killings, and then it kind of peters out.
Masha, would you perceive this, I don't know, similarly bleak?
Perhaps not quite as bleak. Because I do think that there has been, there's something that happens at moments of political crisis, and which also makes the moments of political opportunity, which is that ideas that are unknown or alien to a majority of the population become assimilated into legitimate debate. The fact that we are now operating with the phrase defund the police and perceiving it very much as a subject of legitimate debate, right? And even the sort of the rhetorical reference to it, oh, these are horrible politicians who want to defund the police, that reference that has become almost habitual is actually an indication of how much it has become central to American political debate. That, I think, is a huge change, right? And that's something that often when protest peters out, what you're left with is a significant shift in the conversation. So I think that has occurred. We need a lot more than that to confront what Trumpism represents, right? And what Trumpism represents is basically, and I agree with Mosey here, it's a reversal of this myth of an America that is expanding what the philosopher Moshe Halberstam calls the circle of us, right? An America that enfranchises more and more people as time goes on, however uncertain the progress, but we all kind of always think that the arc of history bends toward justice. And Trumpism basically came along and said, no, we're now going to contract. We're going to narrow the circle. And I think that's a real battle, right? And it is not coincidental that Trump, among other things, has chosen to fight this battle over memory as well.
Yeah, sure.
That he has zeroed in on the 1619 Project, which was an extraordinary special issue of New York Times Magazine, which basically argued that American history needs to be retold as a history of enslavement, right? And that we need to apply sort of that analytical lens to everything in our current situation. It was a great piece of journalism and a really, a major piece of thinking. And Trump reacted to it in, I think, a very visceral way and has been railing against it and has issued a couple of executive orders directly opposed to directly aimed at the 1619 Project. Because there is, in fact, I think, on the one hand, a fairly widespread understanding at this point that we need to correct this narrative of the United States as the home of the free and the land of the brave and the country of immigrants and the country of equality and tell this story in at least one other way. And there's a huge fear of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because this sort of cultural war is you can see it in many areas, I would say. One is the one that you mentioned, the reflection on the legacy of slavery and racial injustice. The other one is if you look at the vocabulary of white masculinity, the idea of the order of nature that should not be reversed, the logic of heteronormativity. All this narrative that you could see in Trump's presidency. Evidently that wasn't his invention, but he copied and repeated the ideological material of the religious right. And so I know that you also researched and worked on this, so I'm curious, is there a danger that we now just focus on Trump and him being kicked out of the White House and not focus on the movements and networks and ideologies that nurtured this ideological framework, so to speak?
This is my huge bias as a writer. Is I very much prefer, even though you're right, I have researched the sort of the international far-right networks and the so-called gender movement against gender ideology, but I always prefer to focus on what's out in the open and visible to all of us, rather than the networks that are no doubt important, but hidden from view. Mm-hmm. I think that ultimately political conversation deals with what's here and what's evident. And the fact that even thousands of people are meeting in conference hotels around the world once a year is ultimately immaterial. Right? What we need to talk about is what we can all have an influence on. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I disagree with it, but it makes complete sense.
Okay.
No, not because I would disagree with what's relevant about what's visible. It's just that I'm worried that if the focus is just on one person, or cabinet, and not on the political movements or religious movements that actually feed the ideology and the terminology, and that then actually explain also why there's such an ability to mobilize. So that's, I think, why I'm interested in these movements. When I prepared for this conversation today, I began to think about what actually happened in those 4 years, and I was surprised how much I had already forgotten. Not forgotten, but how much was. Remember the Muslim ban? I mean, it seems so long ago now. Also, and that is something that I want to talk about. I mean, the anti-immigration policy, the locking up of families and children in deportation centers. There was a time when I was reading frantically, any information I could get about the situation of these families, and I have to admit, in recent months, at least I didn't. And I recalled something Tejo Cole said. He said, there are no refugees, only fellow citizens whose rights we have failed to acknowledge. And so I just wondered, I mean, do we now have to remember all these people who became invisible in the presidency of Donald Trump?
It is interesting to think about how many things we have forgotten since, because news and events have moved so fast and because there's been so much confusion. It's like what do you call it? That seemed like a long time ago. So many things seem like they just like ages ago, and so there are events that are worth returning to, and I think we saw something a couple of weeks ago that there are 500 or maybe almost 600 families or children whose parents have been
could not be
reunited with their parents, and so the effect that these policies have had on people like those. That is ongoing. I mean, these families have been torn apart. And there are certainly people on the ground, activists on the ground and organizers on the ground who are working with them. But we do need, I think, to return as a country to, what does it mean that we had this policy that is really kind of abhorrent to what America is supposed to stand for? I do think that we should be returning to those kinds of things.
Now, you work as an independent journalist, and you've worked for very different papers or platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm interested in your assessment on how much do we have to reflect on the role of journalism in these 4 years, maybe also with regard to that, such an example. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
How come we could forget these effects on these families and the children in the deportation centers?
Yeah.
How disappointed were you with, the journalistic way of coping with the phenomenon of Trump?
I would say I was pretty disappointed, especially in the first election. I think that just a little bit about my background. I, as you mentioned, kind of came of age at alternative weekly papers in the United States, which are alternative in the sense that they are usually a second or a third paper outside of the daily newspaper in the city, but they also tend to be kind of more outwardly progressive in their outlook, and also have the stories tend to have more depth and voice. And so there is the potential to bring kind of more subjectivity to reporting. And I've also done investigative reporting, which I don't need to describe. And so I think that in the first election, what we saw is daily journalism, newspapers and television in particular, kind of getting really caught up in the outrageous, kind of outlandish, unbelievable things that Trump was saying, and kind of not really kind of looking under the hood to see what he was and what he represented, and kind of looking into his past and that kind of thing. And so in that way, I do think that journalism as a whole kind of let us down. I remember there being this sense after the election of shock, the first election of shock and surprise. How could this happen? Not only were the polls wrong, but I was at the Times, but there was a sense that the middle of the country was not understood, that there are these people who had concerns that we did not know about. And I think that was a failing that grows from the way a lot of these outlets are staffed. They tend to be very kind of East Coast Ivy League. When I was at the Times, I think it was most people around, including me, went to an Ivy League school. And we were living in various cities in the country and not really kind of seeing what was happening in the middle. So
well, I would say the idea of a reporter is that you go out, so even if you had been to an Ivy League school, you might travel.
I mean, I think that's true, but something was missed. Something was missed. And I think that there's a way that politics is covered in general, what kind of we call horse race coverage, like who's ahead, who's not ahead, what this poll says, what this poll doesn't say, and very kind of personality driven. We saw it a lot in the 2016 election, that leaves policies uncovered, that leaves, there's a lot that we miss about people's backgrounds. And so I think that there are many places that journalism could have improved, and that I would even go so far as to say that it's possible that if coverage had been different, the first election the result would not have been what they were.
I have another question, a little bit different about journalism, and it's more its function for democratic society that interests me. And the question is, if we assume that the democratic society is dependent on knowledge and information, and on the ability to deliberate publicly on values and policies, what is left of a society if this most basic good that they have in common, namely reality, is permanently called into question? And this is what I think that Trump has done. We touched at that a little bit at the beginning of our discussion, but I'm really concerned. I mean, I'm really concerned that our entire democratic theory depends on the possibility of a society in the public sphere to, to discuss the values and the laws that are governing them. So, Masha, could you comment on that? Do you think is the distribution of knowledge and information, do we still see that unhindered?
So there have been, to me, a couple of points in the last 4 years that were particularly frightening to watch. One was the live coverage of impeachment hearings a year ago, right? Because what that made very clear was that if you just turned on the television and watched those hearings live, you could only do it from one of two sort of reality standpoints. You could come at it from the New York Times reality, the Democratic Party's reality, and then those hearings would be legible to you. Okay. You were observing a president who had abused power being discussed, testified about in Congress. You could come at it from the Fox News or Fox commentators' view of reality, and those hearings would be legible to you as a conspiracy to unseat a legitimate president. But there was no way to view those hearings as any kind of public conversation, any kind of debate, any kind of interaction between two different sides. Yeah. What we were watching were two completely non-intersecting realities. That, to some extent, has also been the case with the election. If I put on the election has been rigged there are millions of people who voted illegally. There are dead people who voted. There are Chinese, there are ballots that are printed in China and brought to the United States and delivered by mail trucks. I'm just regurgitating what's out there, and not just anywhere out there. I mean, I picked up my third grader from school the other day, and he and his friend, whom I drive home from school, were saying that one of their classmates. Now, mind you, this is COVID era, so the class has 6 kids in it. One of their classmates was talking about how dead people voted, and both of these boys were saying, well, that's ridiculous. Everybody knows that dead people can't vote. They're dead, right? But it's very much out there in New York City at a on the Upper West Side at a public school. So if you come at election coverage with that understanding of reality, it is also entirely legible to you.
It's
What
interesting.
you can't do is you can't combine the two.
It's interesting because when you mention the impeachment hearings as an example for people coming together who do not share a common understanding of reality anymore, I thought you would suggest the nomination hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. That's where I have to admit I'm obsessed with it. I mean, with any of these hearings, I even watched the Facebook hearings live. But with the Brett Kavanaugh, I mean, in your most recent book, I think you talk about this in the chapter of The End of Dignity, if I'm not mistaken. And for me, it was interesting because I watched it and I imagined what would I do if I were him and I had to, go through these proceedings. And I had read what he had written, published a prior, statement before he actually went into these hearings, and it read relatively reasonable, I thought. He seemed to accept the procedures. He seemed to, recognize, the gravity of, sexual violence. I mean, it was respectful, I felt. And then when he appeared in these hearings, and I was stunned, and I felt, well, if you ever had to teach a course on white privilege, this is what I would show. I mean, it was amazing, and I think this is also for you a case. I would think where you have these two realities in the same room and they do not match anymore. Is that also an example for you?
Absolutely, but also that, of course, that shift is absolutely amazing, right? What he had written before and what he had actually said in an interview the day, I believe, before the hearings, sounded very reasonable and was addressed to that other reality, the reality in which sexual assault is a grave crime and a huge problem, where an accusation like that, credibly made, would of course derail a nomination to the Supreme Court. And he spoke in the idiom of that reality. And then he enters the hearings and he switches idiolects. He is speaking in the language of the reality in which the very idea of discussing accusations of sexual assault is illegitimate, in which the very idea of challenging Trump's nomination to the Supreme Court is illegitimate. Right? And then, and then we see the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett railroaded through the Senate in the final weeks of the presidency, which what I kept thinking about as I was watching is I thought, okay, well, imagine that everything that decent people have said about Amy Coney Barrett is true. That she is brilliant, that she's a great jurist, that she's a nice person. Like, what would it mean if you were actually, and I don't think Brett Kavanaugh is a thinker, right? I mean, what we have seen of him on the Supreme Court.
I think nobody
so far
claimed he's brilliant.
He's not even smart. He is he is not even particularly literate. Amy Coney Barrett seems to be a different kind of animal. She is, everybody says she's brilliant. She is a thinker, right? So if you value yourself, your career, your intellect, and you have the chance at the age of 48 to become a Supreme Court justice, why would you debase yourself and debase your nomination by being confirmed under these circumstances? And again, that's only if you decide to inhabit that reality in which all of it, any challenge to it, any opposition, anything that's not Trump's word that he should be on the Supreme Court is a priori legitimate.
Would you say that sort of this imbalance in the new Supreme Court with a new judge, will this be his most important legacy?
It's certainly one of the most lasting legacies. I mean, even beyond the Supreme Court, if we look at the federal judiciary in general, I think that Trump took office with, I think it was around 50 vacancies in the federal court, and he has filled all of them with very young judges. In many cases, there were, liberal or judges who had been appointed by liberals who were replaced by more conservative-leaning judges. It has been, I think it's been one of the most successful things that they have done is stacking the bench with really conservative-thinking judges and who have opinions that were even at one time considered outside of the mainstream. It's no longer the case that that you have to be this. Have to kind of have the appearance of being an impartial jurist. Their conservative bona fides are strong and unquestionable, and they're proud of it, and that's who they're putting through. So I definitely think that it'll be one of the kind of long-lasting legacies.
We saw Kamala Harris, at these hearings, quite strongly, within a farce that we all knew it was a farce, and nevertheless trying to actually argue and ask questions and and find out about the bias of this candidate. And does that give you, I don't know, an indication or hope that the Biden-Harris government would, I don't know, try at least to enlarge the Supreme Court, or will they not be strong enough politically to actually maneuver and navigate through that?
Yeah. I see enlarging the Supreme Court as kind of a long shot and not really a realistic political move. I think we're more likely to see some return to near balance if one of the justices passes away, which seems possible. I mean, it's kind of morbid to talk about, but I think that one of them is a little older. But I see that as unlikely.
Masha, do you agree?
I'm afraid it's unlikely as well. And that's part of what I mentioned earlier, sort of my expectation and perhaps my pessimistic expectation that the Biden administration will try to showcase a kind of return to normal politics, as though that normal politics isn't what gave us the possibility of Trump in the first place.
Basically because they're not as progressive as they would have to be to really make a change, or because they don't even have sort of the power in the Senate to push through their ideas.
I think part of it is, at this point, we don't know whether the Senate is going to shift to a slight Democratic majority. But certainly, even if the Georgia runoff races go for the Democrats, we still, and this we won't know this until January, but still there will be a slim Democratic majority in the Senate that will give Biden a little bit of freedom of action, but not a whole lot. I think the Democrats are probably spooked by losing seats in the House in this election. And so I think they're likely to be cautious, but I think it's much more than that. It's not sort of the political calculation. It's the mentality of somebody who is good at working the system and fundamentally believes in it. And in some ways, that's a great thing.
Not just, you mean both, Biden and Harris?
Biden more than Harris, but I think both, yeah. I mean, we know a little bit less about Kamala Harris in that sense. We know a lot about Biden's thinking about this. And he is, he's at the consummate sort of Washington, and I say this with no disparagement, right? He is very good at what he has done his entire life, which is work within the Washington system. Is this the kind of administration that could really reinvent the system, that could say, we need a fundamental institutional and spiritual renewal? We need to question all of our assumptions about the two-party system, about how we think about our government and how it has devolved to the point where it is only really fully functional if you have a monopoly on political power.
The writer and poet Claudia Rankine, whose last book unfortunately is not yet translated into German, but I very, very much hope that, I don't know how many published houses are watching now, it will be translated into German. The book is called Just Us, An American Conversation. And in it there is a poem that starts with the following verse. What does it mean to want? An age-old call for change, not to change. So I'm curious about what kind of change do you desire now?
I listened to what Masha's saying about the consolidation of power and a two-party system and really a narrow range of ideas and creativity and imagination and vision kind of brought to what an American future could be. And the kind of change that I would want would be a more, I mean, if we're talking purely, utopian, a more kind of radical look at the systems that perpetuate inequality in the United States, in education and healthcare. I was kind of wondering what you think about this. I was heartened by, Joe Biden's bringing in people from the progressive left into his kind of transition talks. Sanders and AOC, and thinking about things they'll do around climate change and those kinds of things, just to kind of entertain more radical ideas about what a future could be. I get that our system is kind of built on incremental progress, but that incremental progress leaves me wishing for so much more. I'll leave it there.
I also ask so sort of openly about the desire for change, because Masha said in the beginning, you have to abandon disbelief when we think about what's possible for Trump to do. And I think you also have to think about the opposite, or the other side, which is we have to train our ability for political desire again, for political utopia again. And I think that's what you're saying. You're saying you know, I want there to be a possibility for much more radical imaginary or fantasies than we've allowed ourselves to think about. Maybe Masha, would you elaborate on that also? On what kind of political desires do we have to, I don't know, work on again?
Yes, I agree with that. You know, we need. I think in my dreams, right, the Biden administration would come in and say, "We have stood at the edge of the precipice for the last 4 years, and we have, by some, you know, incredible stroke of luck and a lot of hard work, avoided falling in, but we're still at the edge of the precipice. And in order to step away, we have to have a radical nationwide reckoning. We have to talk about how we got here. We have to talk about what has happened to us. We have to talk about and this is, you know, this is looking into the past in order to be able to look into the future.
Can you repeat it
the
again?
recent past.
Can you repeat it?
Looking into the past in order to look into the future, right? I have a piece that I published in the New Yorker a few days ago about the need for a national reckoning and the need to address the injury of the Trump years. But really, I would think of it as our best chance for establishing a kind of shared reality that could then initiate a conversation about how we live together from now on, right? I think that there's, on a strictly policy level, I think there's actually a lot of potential in the Biden administration for a renewal of the welfare state, or you know, for integrating climate policy into mainstream American politics in a way that will be irreversible, right? Really big things that absolutely need to happen. But a lot more needs to happen. A lot bigger things need to happen. Especially now that we're living through, you know, a major healthcare crisis because of the pandemic, but also a major education crisis because of the pandemic. I mean, we're seeing public education all over the country collapse. It's a good moment to reinvent public education, including primary and secondary schools and universities.
Was my impression correct that the pandemic actually wasn't terribly relevant for voters in this election, or is that a misperception? Is it?
I have not seen. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say I haven't seen polling on that, but it is my impression that people didn't care.
Right. You also.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you explain that?
What do you mean by didn't care?
I mean, I would expect, given the mass death and the, and this is perhaps going back to our two realities thing, but in my mind, unquestionably, poor way in which the administration has handled the pandemic, that people would have been upset by that. I mean, it was my thinking that this was something that fundamentally touched people because it touched their physical well-being in a way that was unquestionable. But that has not happened, and I think it's partly because of the way in which the two different sides are seeing what the pandemic has been.
You know, I think that we haven't had a common experience of the pandemic. And I think that's what we've seen reflected in the election, is that for people who sort of buy into Trump's indifference to the pandemic and the way that the administration has basically refused to handle it, they don't live in a country where 250,000 people have died. And I think, you know, there are a number of reasons for this, but possibly the biggest is it so happened that I spent the first 2 months of the pandemic on Cape Cod, which basically sort of in suburban America, in the very liberal state of Massachusetts. But still, what I realized, and I wasn't in the city, but what I realized was that suburban America doesn't look very different during the pandemic on lockdown than it looks at any other time. You actually can't tell driving down the highway whether the malls are open or closed. You don't know what is happening in your neighbor's house if you can see your neighbor's house. Right? I think it's really brought to the fore just the lack of any kind of social fabric that we have in this country. Things don't happen to us as Americans, they happen to other people.
But that's really interesting, because if you'd asked me what I think the restrictions of the pandemic or during the pandemic really changed for me, it's exactly that. I would say it really affects the texture of the social, how we meet, how we communicate, how we touched, how, even now here in a theater, how we communicate with an audience. And so what's really interesting to me of what you're just saying is that actually doesn't happen in suburban
Exactly.
America, because there is there's not even such a fabric. Is that what you agree?
I would agree with that. I was in New York for the pandemic, stayed in Brooklyn throughout, and kind of was there when there were ambulances every day. Was people on my block got sick. One of my friends in the neighborhood passed away. I would go for walks in the morning, and and I would see ambulances. Didn't ride the subway for 3 or 4 months. I was just biking around, and so I really felt the sudden kind of disconnection that happened. But my hometown is Atlanta, Georgia, and my parents live in a suburban cul-de-sac, and it was totally different from them. When I leave Germany, I'll go to Atlanta, and I don't expect to have the kind of experience that I had in New York, because things are already so separate. Things are already so disconnected. So I think it does make sense that people had very different experiences of the pandemic, depending on their geography.
But you're back in New York right now, right?
Yes, yeah, I've been back in New York since mid-May.
But in New York, you would describe it similar to how I described the experience in Berlin.
Absolutely, yes. And even during this current sort of fairly relaxed stage of pandemic, in New York, my social experience and my, just a daily sense of missing my old life is palpable. But that's specifically an urban experience in the United States. And you can see that reflected in the electoral maps.
There's also a weird thing that happened that, the pandemic really started in cities, and before doctors figured out how to treat it, it was in these places. So all these people died. Like in New York, 24,000 people died, which was traumatizing for the city. But by the time it had moved to other parts of the country, there was a better handle on it. And so fewer and fewer people had been passing away. And so there was the sense, I thought, that, okay, if people are losing their grandmothers or their family members, they will be affected by this. But it hasn't happened that way. Most of the kind of death and serious illness was in the very beginning, and as it has spread to other parts of the country, the death rate has been much lower. And so if they haven't lost as many people, they also aren't feeling it like people in New York and New Jersey and we're feeling it.
One question everybody, I think here, but probably anywhere else, is also concerned about is the question, not what Biden will do next, which is usually the question you ask if somebody's just been elected president, but everybody seems to be asking the question, what's Trump doing next? Which is weird. I mean, it's also really scary, because you should be discussing, what will be the effects on, the climate change with a new president, how will he transform international politics? Hopefully there will be international politics. But everybody seems to be worried about what Trump is doing next. I got a note from my brother who has lived the past 25 years in the US, and he wrote to me and said, Trump is an entertainer who has 70 million fans that voted for him. He must play the encore they expect of him. Otherwise, there's no new tour next year and nobody's going to buy his next album. Is that an explanation of what will happen, that he will continue, I don't know, to build on his supporters?
70 million voters and I think 88 million Twitter followers or something like that. Yes, that's what I expect. There's talk of him returning to television, having some type of television program or network. I could see something like that happening. He, I think, needs to reinvent himself in a way that will be lucrative because he has, as I understand it, hundreds of millions of dollars of personal debt coming due in the next 2 or 3 years. And 2 investigations, criminal investigations in New York hanging over him. So I think he is probably looking for a way to become a figure that is large enough to kind of counteract those things that are waiting for him.
You mentioned prior to the stream, while we're preparing here on stage, you mentioned that among your friends, there's a different kind of fear than the fears you saw before, witnessed before, and that some of them were looking for guns. Does that have to do with the prospect of this kind of, I don't know, violence, this kind of racism still being empowered and supported by a figure like Trump?
I think that's part of it. I also wonder if another part of it is that because of the pandemic, their information from the world has become limited to news headlines, whatever comes across their social media feeds, whatever horrible videos they're seeing. And so there's this way in which focus on those awful things that are happening that are making us scared has become heightened. And the friends of mine who are talking in this way are people who I see as really being somewhat removed from the actual kind of tangible dangers that many people are facing. These are professional people who are of means and who don't, to my mind, face the threat that people who are living in impoverished situations or kind of in more direct harm's way. So to me, it speaks to a heightened fear that I think Trump certainly helped to stoke, but I think is also a product of this weird moment that we're in.
Masha?
I've certainly heard a lot of people talk about the fear of political violence, and I have fear of political violence. I think it is well-founded. We have had more political violence in this country this year than I think we realize. I mean, we assimilate things and normalize things so fast. I think one overlooked factor in sort of the potential for political violence is the pandemic. Right? There are vastly different state policies on the pandemic. Yesterday, I went with my girlfriend and my son. We went to a road course in Connecticut, the neighboring state. And on the way back, we stopped to pick up pizza at a restaurant, and it was a full restaurant. It was like packed with people eating indoors. I was shocked. In New York.
Yeah, which is not allowed.
Not allowed in New York.
Yeah.
But it is allowed in Connecticut.
Okay.
And I stepped away and I realized, oh, I'm in a different state. But I think that as cases spike again, and as states have to confront the fact that they have vastly different public health policies, I think we may start seeing states remember that they have borders, and these borders could be enforced. And I think there's a huge potential, especially in states where there's a lot of arms. There's a huge potential for political violence at state borders, right? Which is something that we haven't had to think
Because they
about
want to
in this
cross,
country.
because they don't want people to enter.
Because they don't want people to enter.
Okay, so that would be in sort of internal social unrest, not to build the wall against the Mexicans, but build the wall against New Yorkers or
non-New Yorkers, as the case may be. Right? I mean, this difference in policy and the risk they're quite real, right? And the sense that no one is taking care of you, that no one is in charge, no one is keeping you safe, is also quite real and well-founded. And the incredible number of weapons in the population.
Could you also tell me what is your, I mean, it's evidently speculation, but what is your speculation on what Trump will do?
I think, if he is offered a nice TV deal that gives him an exit ramp, he will perhaps say that he's quitting the presidency to have a better show. But I would not be entirely surprised if he had to be escorted out of office. Out of the actual White House on January 20th, after Joe Biden is inaugurated.
Okay, now with that note, I thank you both very, very much for being here and for joining us from New York. I do hope, actually, and I do have the idea of maybe we can do this again in 6 months and then reassess how we thought about this 6 months earlier. So maybe you get another invitation for joining another Streitraum in a few months. Thanks very much, Mercy Secrets. Thanks very much, Masha, in New York. And let me tell you when the next Streitraum will be, and I say that in German. Der nächste Streitraum für
the next Streitraum for all of us. I hope also that we are going to be on stage with the public, and here in December, 12 o'clock, right extremism and the police, who is protecting whom. So I hope to see you all back then for the next Streitraum. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.